Hello everybody, welcome to Viking.TV. My name is Damon Stanwell-Smith and I am the Head of Science and Sustainability here at Viking Expeditions. I'm speaking to you from Cambridge in the UK, and today I have an interview that I have been looking forward to for a really long time. In my work, I have the privilege of working with many inspirational people. And as highlighted by recent Viking.TV interviews, for example, with Alison Cusick and Laura Smith on April the 7th, discussing citizen science, or indeed with James Lowen, an ornithologist, who are discussing what you might see on Viking expeditions. And so today we're going to be talking to somebody from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which is the world's preeminent bird research facility. And we are honoured to be working with them on bird-related research, on education, on guest enrichment, and indeed even on the expedition ship design. This is to optimise the wildlife observation capability of our new expedition vessels. So I'm honoured to be introducing our guest today from the leadership of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Christopher Wood. Chris is the Managing Director of the Centre of Avian Population Studies and the director of the acclaimed eBird initiative. So Chris, welcome to Viking.TV. To start with, maybe you could tell us a little of your background and your personal journey.
Thanks, Damon. It's a real pleasure to be with everybody today. You know, I've been looking at birds, I think, as long as I can remember. My parents say that my first words were actually hooting like a great horned owl that was up calling behind my crib. And I've always been very fortunate to travel a lot, and I think we have a couple pictures of me, you know, from sort of my high school years and when I was in college. But the photo on the left is me long ago. That was my senior year in high school when I went to Venezuela with Steve Hilty. He's a very famous ornithologist and author of The Birds of Venezuela and Birds of Colombia. And I've always been just passionate about birds and really think they have a way of teaching us a lot about natural systems. And then after I went to college and when I was in graduate school at Indiana University School of Public and Environmental Affairs, then I was working after that with Rocky Mountain Bird Observatory, which is now called Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. So that other photo of me that had the little owl in it, that's called a northern saw-whet owl. That's from my time when I was working there. And I was also leading trips at that time for the tour company Wings. But back when I was in grad school, there was another project that I was involved in at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and that was being on the advisory panel for eBird, which we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about today. But I was basically asked to apply for the project leader position at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology with Brian Sullivan, who's a great friend of mine. And we went there together. A couple of years later, we were joined by Marshall Iliff. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about the lab's work is, you know, we focus on birds to teach us really about biodiversity, and the power that comes from that is really in being actively engaged and through citizen science. And so I was at the lab for maybe 3 or 4 years. And then I was joined by Jessie Berry. Well, she actually joined the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. A couple of years after that, we got married, bought a house here in Ithaca. That's where I am right now. There's Jessie, and it's just been a really fun journey. You're going to hear a little bit more about some of Jessie's work later today. She runs a project called Merlin, which is basically a bird identification app. And it's a really good entryway into starting to use eBird. So you can start saving your birds in Merlin and things like that. And she manages the Macaulay Library, you know, which you'll hear a little bit more about later.
Well, thank you, Chris. It's a real family affair, clearly. And so to start off with, should we learn more about the lab? So I believe that we have a short video. I was going to say that Chris, you feel free to introduce.
Yeah, so we have a short video that our conservation media team put together, and I think it gives a really nice overview of the lab. So let's take a look at this.
What bird is that?
How much do they eat?
Why are they so colorful? What's that bird doing?
Where do migratory birds go?
What do birds tell us about our changing world?
How can I help?
Will they be here when I grow up?
What a wonderful introduction. That's a lovely short about the lab. Thank you very much for sharing that, Chris. And could you tell us more about how the lab is structured? I mean, how many people are there, the different centers and so on?
Yeah, so Damon, there's about 250 to 275 staff members at the Lab of Ornithology. We're part of the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at Cornell University. It's in the Finger Lakes region of Western New York, this really beautiful area. And the lab itself is broken into these different centers. And so we saw one of the pieces there was produced by a conservation media center. And they produce videos like this, but their real focus is working with partners and local communities and organizations all around the world to tell compelling stories about conservation issues. There's another center on biodiversity studies in higher education. This really explores sort of the origins of biodiversity, how organism functions. There's undergraduates and graduate program here at Cornell. Another center is the Center for Engagement in Science and Nature. And this is really around inspiring the curiosity that video is talking about. People of all ages, all backgrounds, eBird's translated into 40 different languages right now. So making birds as open and accessible to everyone in the world that we can. Then there's the K. Lisa Yang Center for Conservation Bioacoustics. And this is the center that develops hardware and software that allows us to listen to the world, to interpret the sounds of wildlife. This includes a real strong focus on marine mammals too, so there'll be some opportunities. We're really excited to do research with you on marine mammals. But it also includes, elephants, just about any animal that communicates with sounds, fish and electric discharges that they make. I mentioned before the Macaulay Library. This is really the world's premier scientific archive of natural history, audio, video, photography. This is where Merlin is. And then I'm part of the Center for Avian Population Studies. And the key here is, we gather very, very large data sets like eBird, but it can also be radar data that are gathered. And there's a program that we have called Birdcast that, is focused on using sort of big data and then interpreting that and, trying to get some signal out of the noise. And so with Birdcast, we basically do the opposite of what any meteorologists do. We get rid of all of the weather information and we keep all the interesting things. And the way a radar works is it's just sending a beam out, and it hits various things. That could be rain, it could be snow, it could be hail. But if you're really lucky, it could be birds. And so that's what our scientists are really looking for, is trying to understand, when birds are moving at night. This is really one of the only ways that we have to sort of quote unquote see what's actually happening. And then there's the advancement team and administration and business and operations at the lab.
Oh, I love those stories. That long tradition of when you filter out noise out of one signal, it turns out to be the most useful bit for some other element of research. But well, thank you for the overview. We have another film we'd like to show. This is a longer film, and this is an interview which I'll let Chris introduce in a moment, but it gives a more complete explanation of the Cornell Lab's mission. So over to you, Chris.
Yeah, so we'll hear from John Fitzpatrick, who's the executive director of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And this is a presentation, Jesse and I have been involved in giving, introducing high school students who come to the lab who are passionate about careers in science. And this is basically a version of that talk that he's given to a lot of different audiences, and he calls it the Birds Can Save the World talk. And the idea really is about how birds can inspire us to coexist with nature, and sort of how the lab fits into this this overall goal. So let's take a look at what Fitz has to say.
Looking forward to it.
We have, many of us, who care for nature as well as people, this hypothesis that it is not just possible but desirable that human cultures can grow richly and fully over the long term, but do so side by side with functioning natural systems. That's our idea. It's not happening yet, but the hypothesis is that we can get there on this planet still. And if that's going to be true, first of all, it has to be that every single human generation has the passion to try to make it so. And second of all, we're going to need real-time proxies for whether it's working, for how we're doing with natural systems as we human cultures continue to grow and, after all, dominate the planet. And so I've given you the punchline here right off the bat, that we think there is hope for this planet, and a lot of that hope is going to depend on people engaging in nature genuinely, not just watching it from the side. Well, I've had the privilege of being passionately in love with birds all my life, and many of you have too, but the nice thing about birds is that you don't actually have to be passionately in love with them. You don't have to know anything at all about them in order to enjoy the fact that they exist. Everybody, every culture, everybody knows how rich and beautiful this world is because we have them. We just get to do that as humans. We get to just sit and listen to the world. I want to illustrate this idea with a little story, a little vignette here with using a sound that's from our archive of natural sound recordings, the largest in the world. It's the Macaulay Library at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. I'm just going to play you a sound. Just enjoy it. Sort of an odd sound. It's vaguely jazz-like. A little haunting, certainly a little halting. But what a neat sound. The idea that we get to walk around and stop and hear a sound like this coming out of the woods. You just don't need to know anything at all to be appreciative of the fact that we get to hear that. Now, let me tell you what that sound is. That's a sound that was made by one of these birds that decorated the robes of the Polynesian emperors when they first arrived in the Hawaiian Islands about 1,500 years ago. Every one of the larger Hawaiian islands had an o-o on it, and you were just hearing an o-o. Well, The o'os all but went extinct by the turn of the 20th century, save one. That Kauai o'o was the last surviving o'o, and what you just heard was the last surviving o'o, the Kauai o'o, recorded on the mountaintop of Kauai in the Alakai Swamp. And I'm actually speaking literally here. That is the last o'o you just heard. That species was believed to be extinct and rediscovered in the 1960s and early 70s, and this was a recording made about 1976 of a male who was drawn into the playback of the recording because it had no mate. And so it thought, and the o'os were duetting species. Male would call, female would respond. Male call, female respond. So they'd make duets. And what you're hearing is a male waiting for the female response because it had heard this playback. And it was the last o'o. Let's hear that song again now. Hear him wait. We'll never hear that song again. That was the last one, and it disappeared in 1988. And the change that takes place inside you between the first time you heard that tonight and you just think, that's a great sound, the birds just sound so cool, and how you hear it the second time with a little bit of knowledge about what that song was, what that song represents, what that song tells us about our own actions, our own behaviors, our own priorities, our own choices, our own decisions about how to interact with the planet, what that sound tells you, seeing that story. That little difference, with just a few seconds there, is the power of birds. That's why there is a Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Birds have this instant capacity to draw us into stories about the living world, better than any other thing that graces that living world. There are other examples. You're looking at an interesting one right here. For the birders in the crowd, I've delayed telling you what this is. It's a very interesting picture. We took this picture about 5 years ago in Ithaca, New York. For you birders, how thin is that bill? That's not a whimbrel, that's an Eskimo curlew. That's actually not alive. That's Cornell's specimen of an Eskimo curlew that we stuck in the grass with the idea we gotta get a picture of what the thing looked like when it was walking through life, because they're gone. They're gone. They too are gone, like the o'o. We took them all. We took every last one of them. These birds that were called prairie pigeons during their great migrations up the Midwest through the prairie states in the summertime, prairie pigeons, which were slaughtered by the thousands during that period, they got that name because they had replaced this bird, the most abundant bird that has ever lived on planet Earth. 5 billion, with a B, 5 billion passenger pigeons would fly north in the summer to eat acorns and beech mast in the eastern deciduous forests, and then fly south and roost over hundreds of square miles in the southern swamps. And we took every last one of them. And when the market hunters finished their train loads of passenger pigeons heading to the East Coast markets to eat, they moved west and took the prairie pigeon afterwards. This expression of our relationship with the natural world characterized the 1800s, especially the second half of the 1800s, and it was not limited to birds alone. Here's a slide that still astounds me every time I look at it. This is not, you are Westerners here, so you might look at that and say, well, that's somewhere one of those Doug fir forests or one of those Sitka spruce forests up in the Pacific Northwest. No, folks, these are sugar maples. You will never see a sugar maple that looks like this. Your grandchildren will never see sugar maples that look like this. We took them all. The 15-foot diameter sycamore trees that grace the bottomlands of the Midwestern rivers, we took every one of those too, so that the next 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 human generations are not going to see forests like that. all of that makes us wonder, have we stopped doing that yet? Are we in the process, we humans, in the process of deciding we should not keep doing this, that we should actually have a different and more sustaining relationship with these things out there? I think the answer is we're getting there. And actually, there are some signs of hope, even in Hawaii. This is a picture of Haleakala National Park. You're looking out at the crater, and beyond the crater to the windward slopes, the wet windward slopes that are almost always drenched in fog and clouds like that. One of the wettest places on Earth, 14 meters of rain fall under that cloud. And down under that cloud is an amazing forest draped in mosses and liverworts and tree ferns, huge tree ferns. And that forest was home to some really remarkable birds as well. Birds that many of which were thought to be extinct, but then rediscovered in the 1950s as explorations got down into the depths of that part of Maui. And indeed, there are today 500 Maui parrotbills, that upper bird, and there are a couple thousand of the kohikohe, the crested honeycreeper there, second from top. And of course, Hawaii's signature bird, the eevi, still thrives in that forest. And that bird at the lower right, the tragic story, discovered a little too late, actually named in the 1970s and now probably extinct, the po'ouli, but lived under there in that forest. And the reason I'm mentioning these birds is that as a consequence of the rediscovery of these rare Hawaiian honeycreepers, a remarkable band of citizens got together, private and public ownerships, small and large, watershed groups, the Nature Conservancy, local, state, and federal agencies, and brought together this partnership called the East Maui Watershed Partnership that has now basically fully protected that windward slope of East Maui, and is in fact taking out all of the feral pigs out there and allowing the plants to regenerate, and the birds are coming back. And that remarkable success story happened because of the birds. This idea that birds connect us in ways that make us want to act, that even can teach us things about the stuff that we're doing that needs to be stopped, is not new and not unique to Hawaii, of course. The most famous example of all, the peregrine falcon, which along with the bald eagle and a couple of other species taught us in the 1960s that we were poisoning ourselves with a variety of pesticide compounds, which we then took back out of the environment and with a little bit of manipulative help ended up restoring this falcon to a situation where it's now more common in the lower 48 states of the US than it's been for 200 years. Off the endangered species list before the turn of the century. Remarkable success story. This idea that birds communicate to us is in fact the whole idea behind the Endangered Species Act. Of all the flagship poster childs that I could put up of the Endangered Species Act, you've got it right here, the spotted owl. But the spotted owl caused so much controversy in part because people misunderstood what the act is about. And I want to show you the same picture here in its proper scale. There's the owl in its real scale. And that picture is what the Endangered Species Act is about. Let's remember that the owl is simply telling us something about what's going on underneath it. That is the important story. The owl itself, let's face it, folks in the audience, if there were no spotted owls, life would go on. It's not about the owl, the brown-eyed owl. It's about the fact that the owl represents some things that are going wrong underneath it across the system, and the owl is the beacon, the brown-eyed beacon that tells us about the stuff we need to worry about, that connects us with the problems and makes us think about solutions. That idea that the Endangered Species Act is about the ecosystem is not just my construct. It's written directly into Section 2B, Purposes of the Act, by Congress. The purpose of the Act is to provide a means whereby the ecosystems upon which these species depend may be conserved. There is why we did the Endangered Species Act, not because of the condor or because of the owl, but because the condors are telling us something about lead right now. Now, I've been talking so far about this endangered species idea, and certainly we have to pay a lot of attention to endangered species, but I ask the question in the next breath, shouldn't we be listening to all the other species too? Are they telling us things that where they're not yet on the list, but they're communicating to us nonetheless? Before they become kawaii o'os, maybe we should be paying attention to where their populations are going and what those are telling us about our relationship with the planet. This is one of the most popular birds in the eastern forests of the U.S., the wood thrush, a great songster just arriving right now back in the forest. And look at what its population has been doing for the last 50 years. In fact, huge portions of the American bird fauna are showing the same signal, some of them surprisingly strong. Look at the rusty blackbird in this picture, down to something like 5% of the numbers in the middle part of the 20th century. Cerulean warbler on the left. Both species of meadowlarks are common birds of the open grasslands, eastern and western. 30 to 40% declines. The signals are all over the place. The Buick's wren, bird of the forests and east of the Mississippi. Look at what that population has been doing. How many headlines have you seen about Buick's wrens going extinct? Nada. But they're gone east of the Mississippi River now. That signal was totally unheralded, but it was a signal, a very strong signal. And so I want to ask you now, where did we get those data? These are not data from scientists going out and measuring populations of Buick's wrens the way we did in the Florida scrubjay case. These are data from a Christmas bird count. In fact, there are armies of people like you out there doing this every year, some cases every day, getting information into your brains as a result of the passion and, yes, okay, craziness for some of us. But it's not just like there's a few dozen of you. There are millions and millions and millions of you all over the country. All the estimates, year after year, every 5 years, this major survey of American outdoor recreational habits, it keeps telling us the same thing. Something on the order of 70 million people in the U.S. regularly watch nature as a hobby, as a part-time pastime. 1 to 3 million are regarded as avids of these. That's an army. Imagine the power of a group that large. If we actually harnessed even just a teeny bit of that creative, passionate energy that goes into watching nature. Well, that's why we have a Lab of Ornithology at this point. That's one of the central things that we stand for right now. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology is about interpreting and conserving Earth's biological diversity. We're not just bird types. We are focused on conserving the diversity of planet Earth. We do it through research and education and this odd thing called citizen science. And we focus on birds because birds are such remarkable hooks and tools for understanding it. We began really in the 90s to understand the possibilities that exist in the idea of harnessing on purpose the powers of citizens. And we started doing things like the Cerulean Warbler Atlas, a declining warbler, you saw that earlier. And so we created, as a consequence of people like you who wanted to go out there and find where the Cerulean warbler, we found every place in the US where Cerulean warblers breed. We made an atlas of all their places. And the process of doing that, the very process of doing that, put magnifying glasses onto places like this big zone in northern Tennessee. And so the state government of Tennessee bought 50,000 acres and declared it a Cerulean warbler preserve. Not literally, but they made it a forest preserve in which they're trying specifically to manage for the forest structure that would favor Cerulean warblers breeding. The process of getting people paying attention to this makes this happen. Same story up in upstate New York near the Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge. Focusing people on the question can begin to focus energy, passion, and money on the answer. Well, of course, the advent of the internet in the 1990s was profoundly important for us, for everybody in many ways. I regard the internet as the most important invention since the wheel in every respect for humans. But one of the things that it does from an education standpoint, it allows people, common people all over the world, to dive into the nests and watch real biology happen. So getting people to actually be engaged in real biology and even counting and measuring things by way of remote cameras over the internet is a little additional feature that has become part of the citizen science idea. We began to invent first games, but things that they actually became quite very serious games. We were stunned, frankly, stunned at what we received. because we specifically encourage people, you don't have to know a bunch about birds, just look outside your window and do what you can do and report what you can see, and we can build the site filled with ways to learn and so on. And we started getting a lot of checklists back, almost 100,000 checklists covering all of North America, and we have now accumulated some of the most detailed maps of the distributions of birds at that point in the winter that have ever been put together. And the equally important point here is that the data that we have are gathered not by professionals. We couldn't possibly get that sort of data by getting out and measuring it with, hiring grad students or something. No, it's the Army that puts that together. We have access to now as a consequence of cool materials that make it fun to do and easy, and the draw of the birds themselves, and the scale of the Army and the internet. So all of that is now coming together in a really amazing way. So things are emerging at this point, and I want to just highlight this as one of the premier programs right now that we are focusing on and trying to work constantly towards making it better and better to serve you, the birding public of various kinds. It's the place where birding meets science, and it is beginning to take hold at this point. The scale of the information coming in here. Right now we're doing something like 100 to 120,000 checklists a month on eBird. Millions of observations monthly from across North America. Why is that important? It's important because back at the lab, back at Cornell, and elsewhere around the country in nodes of people who want to do this, we can put those data together with a lot of other data that are also available out there now, and start to understand things about birds that we hadn't known before. Imagine if there had been an eBird in the 1870s, when the passenger pigeon was still flying around in at least hundreds of millions, and the scope of that trajectory could become visible to people. Imagine that. Well, we want these data to be available in 100 years and in 1,000 years. We want people to be able to understand the real-time nature of these bird populations, these bird fluctuations, these changes, so that we can begin to have this real-time connection with the planet. In 2009, 780,000 hours were spent collecting data that went into eBird. That's the Army. Imagine that number. Imagine how big that number could actually be and what ultimately can be the result of that as we think about our relationship with the planet. And so we've begun to do this thing called the Avian Knowledge Network, and we've created a network of computational centers around the country where the data are coming in and where the data can get crunched. So we can actually do genuine, hardcore data mining, is the phrase used for this, and find out some things that we never knew before about birds. A couple of examples here. This is purple martin. Watch the map and watch the graph here. The number of places that it occurs goes way up in the summer, but the number of birds per spot is low, and then that goes up while the other one goes down when they begin to flock in late summer, and you start seeing the flocks appear as red dots here. Then they're the final places with just a few staging areas, and then the bird suddenly disappears. Back to Brazil. We can do this for every year, for every species. Now we started doing things like this, what we call the heat map. Watch the yearly pattern of distribution of the eastern phoebe. So there's phoebe, and what you can see here is how quickly they move in the, look at the western portions coming down south now before the eastern ones do. And then the eastern ones follow. So we have different populations leaving at different times. So we're beginning to see the real sort of guts of the population movement as a consequence of these data. Here's a nice western, watch the explosion in the west in the summer. The savanna sparrow explodes in its migratory habits out in the west here. There's the Central Valley population that stays all year, almost all year. Boom, there it is again. I mean, this is kind of like watching fire, isn't it? You could just keep watching this, and of course the key will be to be able to compare these year after year and begin to do this three-dimensionally through time in order to understand trends. When we typically look at this thing, it's just too much information, but we can actually ask questions. Well, are there some places where the western meadowlark is consistently declining, little holes where it just is getting less and less common? That is the kind of thing that we can only get at using citizen science, we believe. Our goal ultimately is to keep these common birds common. I'll just close by saying that it's typical for us to be thinking about birds as our North American birds, but let's remember that the birds migrate down south, and many of our birds winter across the Central and South American parts of our hemisphere. And so we have begun to create eBird in several different languages and for all the cultures that live south of us all the way down to Chile. So eBird is now genuinely a hemispheric-wide process. We have a wonderful story told to us a couple of years ago about this young man in West Mexico who helped a biologist for a few days taking birds out of a mist net, and is now one of the major communicators working with a series of ejidos in western Mexico talking about sustainable agriculture, sustainable forestry. He was converted into a lifelong, passionate environmental communicator by the birds. This idea that birds connect us to nature is universal. And I want to close by showing you what I am privileged to be able to look at when I wake up in the morning and have my cup of coffee. This is looking out my deck. Most of that is forever wild, protected land across Cascadilla Creek. I will go ahead and say, in case you think that's paradise, that looks like that a lot of the time of the year, but it's pretty nice then too. But most importantly, what I want to do is ask you not to focus on my place. Close your eyes if you want, focus on your place. Because you have a place. Everybody in the world has a place. And the idea that we are, I think, on the edge of as humans right now is that we have the capacity, for the first time in the history of people, we have the capacity to interact with our places, not just individually through enjoyment, but also intelligently through recording things. And because we can put these things together now at scales of the kind that you're just trying to see, we are on the outskirts of being able to have, as a human species, to represent for the first time in the history of planet Earth, a genuine sensor that is constantly monitoring how we're doing. This notion that we are on the outskirts of having a different relationship with the planet, that we can, by observing and by recording and by collectively analyzing and by visualizing, we can actually understand our influences on the planet better than we ever could before. This is the way that birds are changing the world. Our goal, genuinely, is that we have a new relationship with the Earth. It is, we have to remember, our only place. It's our origin, and for many of us, it is our house of worship. And we now have opportunities that we've never had before for worshiping it in ways that will help keep those natural systems natural, and ultimately allow us to figure out how it is that we will fit in with all this grandeur.
Well, that's a very powerful message, that how we fit in with all this grandeur. It makes me reflect. And in fact, John's words do remind me of the reflection by the great Senegalese conservationist Baba Dioum. In the end, we will conserve only what we love. We will love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we are taught. And I guess I could rephrase that to change to taught to experience to we will only understand what we experience. That's very much around experiential learning. I know, Chris, you have some thoughts on this.
That's, it's interesting you say it that way, because I think that's a really complementary way of thinking about what the lab's mission is. And I think part of why we're excited to really do research with Viking, because it gives people an opportunity to go to some amazing places where some of the ecosystems may be a little more simple in terms of the amount of complexity compared to sort of the tropics. But the ability just to be totally transformed, you know, when you've been in a colony of penguins, or, you know, the effect that birds can have. And that it's that, you know, as with the story of the Kauai-o-o that Fitz shared, you know, it's this power that birds have to, with a little bit of knowledge, really encourage you to change behavior or think about what is our relationship with the natural world going to be. And I think there's some great opportunities for people to sort of think about that, but do it in a way that's really fun, you know, and engaging and looking at birds.
Awesome. Absolutely. And indeed, that whole subject of citizen science is, as you note, is of course super important to Cornell and important to Viking expeditions as we look to see how our guests can engage. And it reminds me actually of some previous experience I've had with the UN Environment World Conservation Monitoring Centre. About 10 years ago, I was involved in gathering biodiversity data for all taxa, tracking the status of global biodiversity at that time. And my memory of the time was that 55% of all the data we're using across all taxa were bird data, but it was coming from all disparate sources. And I guess that might chime with the sort of the rise of eBird, which are, you know, super inspiring. And I wonder if you could share with us what your reflections of how eBird has taken over in a good way.
Yeah, I think, you know, for us, you know, eBird really began as a project that was focused on the US and Canada. And that's where our emphasis was. And then we had a meeting with Humberto Berlanga, who's, you know, this incredible visionary in Mexico at Canabio. And he said, you know, I would love to be able to sort of take these tools and adapt them to Mexico and figure out how we can use those. And that we've basically used that as a launching off point and spent a lot of time listening to people around the world for where and when they're interested in sort of being part of this larger community. And by, you know, pooling resources into a common platform, you know, there's a lot of efficiencies that you gain. It ends up being more economical because everybody's contributing the same project. And then when you go through things, development efforts, everybody can benefit from that. And it's been really exciting for us to just sort of see some of these different ideas. So there were some people really interested in being able to, well, the lab was, in this case, really interested in integrating the Macaulay Library, you know, this amazing resource for sounds and videos and photographs of birds and other biodiversity, and integrating that in a way that it would be more accessible to people. And so when we brought Macaulay Library and eBird together, then all of the, you know, hundreds of partners around the world that are using eBird really had the opportunity to then contribute those. And so that's really what we've been doing on the outreach side. And then as eBird and sort of the engagement piece has grown, there's been a similar really focused work on the science side. And we've really been at the forefront of big data analysis. And so in the same way that Brian Sullivan and I came in and really started thinking about how do you engage people around the world to participate in a project, you know, Daniel Fink came to the lab and has been, you know, in part leading this team of statisticians and computer scientists to really think about, okay, how do you take the billion with a B records that are in eBird and then use them so that you really understand birds in a way that was never before available. And so we have another video that the conservation media team that sort of weaves this story together. And I think if people aren't tired of watching these videos yet, there's one more that we really would like to share that just sort of gives an overview of eBird.
Every day, millions of people around the world enjoy watching birds and recording their sightings.
What if there were a way to take all of these observations, yours, ours, everyone's, and put them all in one place?
If we could do this, we would fundamentally transform not just birding, but science and conservation.
From this idea emerged eBird. Put simply, eBird is a way for anyone around the world to store their birding observations, their photos, their sound recordings, and make them available to educators, scientists, and birders. It's incredibly easy to use, and it's incredibly powerful. All you do is let us know where you went birding, when, how far you traveled, and what you saw. It's powerful because hundreds of thousands of people all around the world are doing it, and it's growing. eBird already safeguards 500 million sightings, information that allows all of us to understand the movements and needs of birds at global scales. eBird maintains your lists for you and shares them with other birders from around the world. By sharing, it's now possible for anyone, anywhere, to find your target birds and the best birding hotspots any time of the year. Before eBird, there was no way to comprehensively understand population-level movements of many species. By combining your sightings with remote-sensed habitat data from NASA, we're able to generate species distribution models that provide an unparalleled view of where and when birds are in the landscape. Scientists and students all over the world are now able to use eBird datasets for their research at a variety of spatial scales. These observations help inform better conservation strategies, opening the door to the future of bird conservation. And this is just the beginning. With the help of millions of people who come to eBird each year, we are creating a free, open access system that is easy to use, fun, and rewarding. Rewarding for birders, for scientists, for conservationists, and ultimately the birds themselves. Go to eBird.org or download eBird Mobile to get started, all for free. By joining eBird, you're joining a global team of people that share your passion for birds. Be a part of it.
It's always fun for me to watch that, and I think what I'd like to do is really dive in and show a couple of the products, a couple of the visualizations that we looked at there. One of these, here's an example of sort of what we're able to do with all of these data. And so what happens is birdwatchers are contributing checklists that include information about what we call the birding event. And so that is, did they go out for 5 minutes? Did they go out for an hour? Where did they go? Where did they walk? And then we're linking that with remote sense data that we're getting primarily from NASA, but other very large data providers. And with those, we're able to then start to understand the ecological patterns that exist, that, how are orioles using different habitats and how that can change. So what you see here are a couple of range maps that are the result of these data models. And basically what you see is red is the area where these birds are breeding, blue is the area where they're wintering, and then yellow is the place where they're migrating. And so on the left is Bullock's oriole, on the right is Baltimore oriole. And you can see just in more detail than we've ever been able to see before, exactly where birds are, how abundant they are. And the other thing that we can do that gets to be really, really fun is we can look at that week by week. So we're going to look at this now for a bird called Canada warbler. Canada warbler, as you can see here, is a bird that winters in the Andes, and it then moves north in the spring. And so this should be an animation that allows us to see sort of in April, they make this jump crossing over the Gulf of Mexico. And you see just how briefly they're actually in the US and Canada. They spend most of the time in South America. So we can then start using these data to understand when and where birds are really every single week of the year. And that opens up some really incredible conservation opportunities.
It's fascinating. You know, every time, Chris and your colleagues, every time you show new ways in which eBird data can be used and the power of big data and the way that just the resolution that you can get on things like that migration. I understand that there is also uses of eBird data in terms of practical on-the-ground species management. I wonder if you share any examples of that.
Yeah, you know, we had a paper in Biological Conservation maybe 3 or 4 years ago now that detailed several hundred different use cases of how eBird data have been used. So part of the idea is that all of the data that come into the lab are shared with the global scientific community. So anyone watching this, if you wanted to, you can go to eBird, you can request the billion records, download those, and hopefully you have a beefy computer to be able to play with those. But one of the really cool examples of how partners have used the data is with the California Nature Conservancy. And what they did is they had this idea that when you take data like this with a Canada warbler, where you can see where birds are every single week of the year, you can start thinking about conservation in really novel ways. And so they said, you know, when I go traveling, I don't actually buy a house when I'm going to be somewhere for 2 weeks. You rent, maybe you do an Airbnb. If you're going on a cruise, obviously you'd be going with Viking, and you'd have everything with you as you go through Antarctica or the Great Lakes. But in the case of shorebirds, you know, what shorebirds needs, they need to go and land, and some of these birds are making really remarkable journeys where they'll travel thousands and thousands of miles, and so they require these staging grounds. And so the Nature Conservancy thought, well, you know, what if we were to provide habitat in the Central Valley for shorebirds at the time that they most need them? There's not a lot of habitat. There are some national wildlife refuges and state lands, but most of the Central Valley of California is really a highly industrialized agricultural system. And so their idea was to use lands that's used for rice farming and then pay farmers to basically put water on the habitat when these shorebirds would be going through. And so then they used the eBird data that said when and where those birds were likely to be if you could then put water on the habitat. And so the result was some of the highest concentrations of shorebirds that have ever been seen in the Central Valley of California. So I think it's a really cool example of just how these data contributed by, you know, hundreds of thousands of bird watchers all around the world can be used by, you know, really innovative thinkers to really affect conservation on the ground.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, I'm reflecting on when you introduced Jessie and her work managing Merlin, being the other end of the scale. We've seen big data and the remarkable cross-continental modeling you can do and specific species management. And in fact, there was actually a question that's come in, I think I'm just going to pose this now, which may prompt us on this. And this is from Kathy in Garden City in the US. And she asks, how do beginners get started in bird watching? And I think that might be a nice segue into reflecting about Merlin.
Yeah, Kathy, that is a great question. And I really appreciate it because the idea behind Merlin is really to do just that. One of the big challenges when you're trying to get started is just understanding what birds are possible in a certain place. So Merlin is a free app that's available in the Android store or the Apple store. And basically what it does is it started out initially as a National Science Foundation grant. A lot of our research starts with support from the National Science Foundation. And with Merlin, the idea was to ask a series of questions. And it would be very much as if you were in the field with a Viking expedition leader. They would ask certain questions if they were trying to identify a bird. So they'd say something like, where was the bird? Was it flying over the ocean? Was it sitting on a cliff? Was it diving? What's the behavior of the bird? And so the idea is for Merlin to teach you sort of the questions. What's the color pattern? What's the behavior? And then it ties into the eBird database, because the eBird database basically has a probability matrix for anywhere on Earth about what birds are most likely in any location. And that can be really, really powerful, because that's the piece that's really hard for somebody who's just starting out to know, like, what are even the 50 birds that are most likely in my yard? And so with Merlin, you can turn it on and you can actually get a list of the most common bird to the least common bird just for where you are. So many people now have cameras, so you can take a picture of bird. And there was a photo identification module that was added into Merlin a few years ago. And with that, you basically take a picture of a bird, upload it, draw a box around where the bird is to separate it from the background. And then that gives you an answer of what the computer ID, the visualization model, thinks that the bird is. And we're now at a really exciting point. You all will be some of the first people to hear this news, but on the 21st of June, we're going to be launching a new module to this, and that's to answer the question that really is the most common question that we ever get. And I think it's also a question that Viking expedition leaders get as well. And that question is, what is singing? Who is singing? And so if we go forward a slide, what we're going to do is we're going to enter Sapsucker Woods. This is the place where the Cornell Lab of Ornithology is, and we're going to hear some of the sounds. And so if you were there with me, I'd be able to tell you what we were hearing. And so as you listen to this, go ahead and in the chat, you can answer what some of the birds are. Kind of wait, and you have sort of 2 or 3 species that you think you know what they might be. Go ahead and let us know. It's kind of a fun way for you to participate here. And so let's go in here. And so with Merlin, when you turn it on and press the sound ID button, basically what it'll start doing is telling you what birds it's detecting and then what it's identifying them as. And so you can hear in this, there's cardinal, ovenbird, wood thrush, chestnut-sided warbler. If you then touch any of those, if you click on them, then you're able to see sort of more information about it. So one of the things that's been really fun as we've been testing this in the last couple of weeks is there's a lot of people at the lab too who, on the technical side that are really interested in birds, but they're not experts, but they really want to find out more about birds and know like what's around. And so they've taken this out with them and they've just sort of had it, and they've been looking at it and like, what is that singing? And then say, oh my gosh, that's a rose-breasted grosbeak. I've never seen a rose-breasted grosbeak. I'm going to look in Merlin and read the text. Tells me a little bit about where to find rose-breasted grosbeak. And so we really think that, with Merlin and then going out in the field with experts, that's really all it takes is just going out, looking, being curious. And we're really excited that, now really in a week, this app will launch. You can get it right now, and it's available. For the app works basically anywhere in the world, but there's certain parts of the world that aren't yet covered by sort of information. So that you'll see the name, but there may not be some text for it. But in the U.S. and Canada and all of Europe, most of Central and South America, northern South America are covered. And then the other piece to this is that the sound ID module is sort of a different module. So there's the information that's sort of the frequency, the text, and the sounds. And then this is sort of bleeding edge technology and being able to classify these. And so we're starting with about 450 birds in the US and Canada. For those of you in the United Kingdom, you know, you could still play with it if you can find your Asian collared dove or starling or house sparrow. Luckily, some of you have come to the U.S. and left us with some of your friends, and so you're able to at least try it on some of those. But it'll be I think a really fun experience for people to try this. And the goal is to continue rolling out these vision models in the next couple of years.
It's so exciting, Chris. And just specifically about the different areas, with the packs that you download, enable Merlin and eBird to run offline when out of the internet coverage, for those of the viewers that might be reflecting on whether it'll work in the high Arctic or down in the Antarctic and so on. And indeed, we at Viking are working to support the lab on developing new packs for the Antarctic and the Atlantic Ocean as well, so that the places that Viking expeditions go, that guests that are heading south, migrating like an Arctic tern, heading down, will be able to have offline on Merlin on devices to be able to do that recognition. So, I mean, it's so exciting, as you say.
We really appreciate Viking's support in this collaboration. We really do think of it as a collaboration where our scientists are really able to understand more about how to do all of the types of things that we've outlined here, and you know, really excited to continuing this journey with you.
Well, it's so exciting. I know people say this in interviews, but I can hardly contain myself with the enthusiasm about the potential for eBird, as you've highlighted in the films and you're sharing with us. Just, I think it's the way that big data are going to transform the world in a positive way. I think we often hear stories, especially the last year and a half, about things that are more challenging, but this feels like a real success story and continuing to be so. For those that are, thank you so much. There's lots of questions coming in. So as this is a live broadcast, Chris and I will, especially Chris actually, will be I'll be posing the questions and Chris will endeavour to answer them. When we've finished on the interview side, we will be looking to answer all your questions. But before we get to there, I know there's a sort of lighter side to ornithology, to conservation. I wonder whether, to finish from an interview side, if you had any anecdotes from a birding related that you might wish to share with our viewers.
Yeah, you know, the one that I think comes to mind is, and I think there was actually a question in the chat about data quality and how we handle data quality. And a lot of that is we work with experts all around the world. And the first things that experts do is they define sort of the seasonal window when birds are possible within an area, and then what the maximum number that you'd be likely to see is. And so they work on these filters. We then supplement that with the data that are actually coming into eBird, and there's this sort of interaction effect that happens between sort of the data and then experts, and it's a pretty cool instance of human computing interaction. But one of the things that I get to do is travel around and meet with people that are using eBird. So I went to Nebraska, which is in the central part of the United States, and it's a location that's just famous for concentrations of sandhill cranes. Hundreds of thousands of cranes gather there. So when I went there, I said, you know, I haven't met one of our regional editors here. I'm gonna reach out to this person and just connect with them. So I wrote to them and said, you know, I'm going to be here on these dates. It would be great if we could connect. Maybe you can come. It looks like you're, you know, 30 minutes away from where I'll be. Maybe we can connect. And he wrote back and said, yeah, you know, I'll see if I can get a ride. And I figured, you know, you make certain assumptions, and you know, bird people tend to sometimes be on the older end, particularly experts who are part of the data quality team. So I said, you know, he's probably an older gentleman who may not drive anymore, so he's going to get a ride. That's great. So I got there, and it was before sunrise, waiting in this like Denny's parking lot for somebody to come up because we're, you know, going to go on a bird watching trip. And so as I was waiting for him to come up, you know, this kid comes up to me. He's like 13 years old, and he said, "Are you Chris Wood?" And I looked at him and I was like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Well, I'm your Nebraska eBird reviewer, but boy, you sure are a lot younger than I was expecting," which was just a kind of a fun story about the assumptions that we make. And then also it also shows a different time. Unfortunately, that wouldn't happen anymore. Now there's waivers that people sign with volunteer agreements. And if you're under 18, I would know that you're under 18. But at that time, early in the history, and even now, the number of people around the world that engage with birds in a really deep level is really impressive. And it's one of the most fun things about my job is just opening email in the morning and having messages come in a dozen different languages and having to go over into Google Translate to sort of try to figure out what some things may say, and all of us sort of working together. So it's a fun, really fun.
I mean, it's as you say, I could just imagine that voice, and but in a way there is, as well as being funny. I guess it was funny at the time, but as you say, that the egalitarian nature, the breadth from the young to the more elderly, and everybody in between, that are unified by an enthusiasm for birds, as John said in his presentation earlier in this conversation. They really do maybe lead us to be able to save the world. It is very unifying, and I do hope that those that are watching who are planning to join us on expeditions, which we hope will be many of you, that we hope that from our expedition side, I'm working with the lab, with Cornell, to make sure that the birding side is as enriching and as exciting and is as complete an experience as possible. So at this point, I'm going to sincerely thank Chris for taking the time to share your expertise and your insight and your personal journey about eBird, about the lab, about Merlin, and everything in between. And then we'll go on to the Q&A section. So thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Damon.
And also thank you, Viking TV viewers. So for those that are wanting to hear more about what Chris has been sharing, I can see that the questions have been flying in, and we'll go into our Q&A session.
Great.
So James, shall I go straight into question and answers? Super. Well, back to Q&A. So are you ready, Chris?
I think so.
First of all, I've seen a question that's come in that actually I'm going to cover off because it was from one of the films. Mary from Fort Worth says, why was the girl seeming to pour Coke into a birdseed feeder in the photo near the end of the video? Was it the bird seeds in the plastic bottle? Because it sure looked like Coke. I am confused.
I think you weren't the only one. There were several of us when we were looking at it as well. But I think you're right. It's actually much easier to use sort of a 2-liter bottle and sort of fill that up with the seed, and then you can turn it upside down and pour that into the feeder. So that's what a lot of people do. Some people, actually what I do is something very similar. I use a gallon milk jug and I take off the bottom and I scoop the seed up and then, take the lid off. And so it's a good way to fill feeders.
Well, I even think James, our producer, wondered whether or not birds like Coca-Cola too. So thank you, Mary. And then another, so Mariana from Swansea has asked, how did Cornell become such an authority on ornithology? Thank you for such an interesting presentation. That's for you, Chris.
That's a great question. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology started in 1915 with Arthur Allen. And at the time, he was a professor at Cornell University in the Department of Entomology and Limnology, right? So insects on one hand, and then studying freshwater streams, chemical, biological, physical features. And what he decided was that when you went into his office, you were actually going to the Lab of Ornithology. So he put that up. And sort of the guiding principles that Arthur Allen had in 1915 are really the same ones that guide us today. In addition to, having a graduate degree program where people could study ecology and really sort of pioneering the field of ecology. He was also able to really take an interest in sort of connecting the community, in this case, just people around Ithaca, New York, a fairly small town in upstate New York, and showing the wonders of birds to people in the community. So what that looked like in 1915 was a lot of the wives of professors who would join him, and it was every bit as important to him to do his weekly walks at the south end of Cayuga Lake and collecting data about when the birds were coming back, how many individuals that he found on those trips, as sort of the in the classroom component was. So it's that's been sort of our North Star, if you will, our guiding light for more than 100 years now.
Oh, that's fantastic. It takes a champion, doesn't it? So it takes people. That's fantastic. Well, thank you for that. Thank you, Mariana. I've got a question here. I think I might be able to help. Chris, you've been having to. Estelle from San Diego has asked, I've heard that the ships in the Antarctic have bird mode. Please, can you explain what this is? So for Viking expedition ships, we have bird safe mode. And this is a mode that we have built into the new vessels, in fact, in consultation with Cornell, to make sure that there's absolutely limited extraneous light when we're in certain locations, certainly, for example, in misty evenings around seabird cliffs and that kind of thing, where there is an increased risk of birds striking the ship. And so reducing the opportunity of birds to get disorientated and then flying towards the lights and then landing on the decks. And that is a phenomenon, sadly, that does occur on all vessels. So we have built this in from, so controlled by the bridge to control all the lighting in one go. And then built associated with that is actually our Nordic balconies, which are the way that all of the plate glass windows and all of the staterooms that look over the ship, they can all open up sort of horizontally, a little bit like a sash window, which essentially creates every cabin, every stateroom becomes a bird observatory. So in the round, we are seeing this as bird safe mode. So thank you, Estelle. I've got another question here. Tacey in Bethesda in the US asks, does Cornell work with other birding organizations that focus on rescue, rehabilitation and release? For example, Save Our Seabirds in Sarasota in Florida.
So we do that, but I would say that isn't sort of the primary focus of what the Lab of Ornithology does. Certainly within Ithaca, where we're sort of part of this community, there are wildlife rehabilitators. And usually what we do is, so people will write into us, and then what we do is we tend to pass those off to experts in different regions who are in that type of work. Really, really good question.
No, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Tacey. I've got a nice question here from Donato, Oxford, Mississippi. In the future, will I be able to talk to birds with eBird?
That's an interesting
philosophical question, isn't it?
That's an interesting question, and I guess it has to do with sort of what we mean with talk and how we communicate. I don't know. I would say I don't know today how we would go about doing that. There's certainly things that people can do with Merlin. Sometimes you'll see this where Merlin includes the different sounds, and you can play the sound and the bird will hear the sound and it'll come in. You actually want to be really, really careful about doing that, because that song is basically a bird being territorial. And so you could think of it as, a bunch of guys at a bar lined up and sort of pumped up on testosterone. That's sort of what happens in spring with birds. Birds are pumped up on testosterone. They have a lot of hormones, and when you're playing the sounds to a bird, it can lead to misunderstandings, much like what I've heard could happen in a bar. So it's something to be careful about, because we have to be if we want to communicate with birds, we have to have a really, really good understanding of sort of what everything means and how those vocalizations may change based on different times of the year. So it's a very, very complicated question, but really interesting.
It is, isn't it? Very philosophical, isn't it? Well, thank you again, Donato. Another one here, considering how much we're discussing about citizen science observations, Nancy in Leeward in the US asks, how do you know if the bird sightings reported by citizens are accurate?
Yeah, so I started getting at that a little bit in my anecdote in Nebraska. So we have this team of experts all around the world who basically are setting these data quality filters. And then if you report something, so suppose I went to London and I said that I saw a bald eagle. The first thing that would happen within the app is it would say, you know, bald eagle's pretty unusual. Make sure you try to get a photograph or a sound recording of it. And that's really helpful because it's a way of alerting somebody that something's unusual to try to get some evidence at the time. And then if I'm still convinced I saw a bald eagle, I could upload the photo or the video or the sound. Or if I didn't get that, as I probably wouldn't because there wouldn't be a bald eagle there, I could write some notes in. And then the regional experts would then, you know, correspond with me. And for me, it's one of the really powerful things about eBird because you can connect with experts in your local community who often are able to share, like, well, you know, it's pretty unusual to get that species at that date. There's this other one that looks more similar. Around here, we've been seeing this year. So you can get a lot of very focused information on your region that can help with that. I mean, and that's a big component. There's also a lot of things that the science team does. And so the false positives are ones that I think immediately come to mind where people think that they've seen something. But even bigger issue for us is that nobody is ever able to detect all of the birds that are actually there. You know, birds may be, if they're a cavity nesting bird, they might be in the cavity. They could be perched high. They may not be vocalizing. It could be very windy and rainy. So there's a lot of complexity in terms of the observation process. And so that's part of the reason that in eBird, we ask people to, you know, to turn on the track to allow us to see where you went and then know, you know, how far you went, what time it was. And then we can start to sort of understand differences between different observers. And so you can use that data just to see what those differences might be in terms of an expert. It'll take them a shorter period of time to find most of the birds that are there than somebody who's just sort of beginning. And so there's a lot of science that goes into the process of data quality. I'd say about a third of my time to half of my time is spent thinking about data quality and scaling data quality.
I think it's very pertinent. In my view, often when non-specialists are collecting these data, that so much more effort is put into the quality control that net it's probably more rigorous than when it's solely professional experts who sometimes are not as diligent about questioning their own visualizations or whatever. So thank you, Nancy. I've got a nice one here so Mika from Montclair in the US says, we were on a cruise ship near Cape Cod and sitting on our balcony, we saw a peregrine falcon landed on the second deck of the vessel. And so we made pictures hanging over our balcony with the bird that hitched a ride for quite a while, looking at us constantly. So there's your bald eagle in London. I think probably a peregrine in Cape Cod sounds more likely, but thank you, Mika, for the reflection. That nice story.
That's a great story. I mean, and every one of these stories opens up just sort of all of these opportunities for understanding. And, you know, falcons are unusual among raptors in being some of the few birds that actually, in terms of hawks and raptors, that actually will fly over water as part of their migration. That is sort of what they do. A lot of other things like broad-winged hawk or red-shouldered hawk or eagles, they're basically using thermals. So basically the hot air that's rising, they'd rise on these so they don't have to use much energy, basically rise on the thermals and then glide over to the next thermals. falcons are different, and peregrines are sort of these champions for flying over water. But I guess your example shows that they can be tired too, and
yeah, it's right.
And
why not?
They could wait, or depending on the time, they could be, using it as a perch, and then looking for other, birds that might come by to hunt, as they're birds that are sort of moving north. That they could, peregrines can just pick them out of the sky. So
yeah, absolutely.
What a great experience.
That must have been fun, wasn't it? It's so exciting having a peregrine sitting there. I've got an interesting question, very topical, considering what the world has been through the last year. Kevin in Potomac says, how has the pandemic affected bird life? It seems to me that there are more birdsong these days than pre-pandemic. Do you think this is the case?
It's a really good question, and something that some scientists at the lab and other scientists are starting to look at. And so far, part of what we're also finding is that some of it has to do with the observation process that we were talking about. So before, there was a lot more noise in the environment, and particularly, last February, March, March, April, May, the world became a much, much quieter place. And so I think a lot of people started noticing and appreciating songs more than they may have before. Whether there was actually more song, I don't think we've seen as much evidence for that, but we definitely have seen that people are noticing the song a lot more. And that's really one of the fundamental things that we're trying to disentangle when you have sort of a sensor network out there. What are the things that are attributable to the sensor that's sort of sensing and interpreting the world versus the actual biological signal?
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Kevin. That's an interesting reflection for the future, isn't it? Got now a polar question here. Valentin from Newport asks, would you say the Arctic or the Antarctic more interesting for birdwatching?
Well, I'm not sure if you have kids. Let's assume you have a son and a daughter. And I would say that would be sort of like, who do you love more, your son or your daughter? I mean, those are just two amazing sides of the same planet. And I could, whichever one of those two places I would be where I would want to be. I mean, they're just two of the best places.
I know, you're absolutely right. I feel exactly the same way. I mean, I've been privileged enough to work extensively in both, and whilst I'm not a bird expert like you, even to the non-specialist, the birding in both ends of the world are, well, it's extraordinary. I mean, certainly south, it's home of birds, and in the Arctic also. So thank you, Valentin. I'm sorry, we're dodging that, aren't we, by saying can't pick between our children. On another birding site question, Joan from Homestead, US asks, so Chris, in your opinion, what are the top 3 birding sites for unique breeds in the world?
Yeah, that's a hard question, because it has to do with sort of the size of a country. So if you looked at it in terms of countries, Australia, because it's a continent that has been separated for quite a bit of time, probably has more unique species than just about anywhere else. Indonesia also has tremendous diversity, and if that's 2, you're capping me at 3. So I'll go with the bird continent is South America. There's no question there's more species of birds than anywhere else. And while Brazil has fewer species than Colombia and Peru, Brazil has more endemic species. That is to say, birds that you just find, and it's really because most of those are not in the Amazon. A lot of the birds in the Amazon are shared with other countries that are in the Amazon, like Peru and Ecuador and Colombia. But really, the Mata Atlântica, which is the Atlantic forests of Brazil, which are some of the really most threatened ecosystems in all of the Americas right now. So, boy, but I could answer that question for the next.
Well, no, it's a tough one, Chris. Asking you with all your experiences around the world. But interestingly, actually, that Atlantic seaboard of Brazil is certainly where we're going to be sending our vessels north after coming up from the Antarctic. So there is a voyage. Those that want to step off at Rio and explore more into the interior there around on that Atlantic seaboard. But thank you, Joan. I have now another reflective question. Some very good questions coming in here. So you're holding your attention there, Chris. You're doing very well. Thank you. So Israel in Venice says, and I'm not sure if this is Venice, Italy, Venice, California, Venice, Florida, or Venice somewhere else. Israel says, some feel that in rapidly urbanizing places, birds of prey should be fed meat as their natural habitat is being taken away from them. What do you think about this? Does this not somewhat domesticate a wild animal and make them dependent on people and therefore hurt them, not help them?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable interpretation. I think, what we're seeing is that cities are profoundly different landscapes than anything that existed before. And so we're seeing that a variety of different types of different organisms are starting to adapt to cities. And that peregrine falcon that we were talking about, that's certainly one of them. There is no need to put any food out for a peregrine falcon because there are pigeons in cities, and they will do very well on feeding on those pigeons. And another bird that in towns and even cities now that's increasing is Cooper's hawk. This is a bird. It's sort of like a peregrine falcon. It's another raptor, but this one has rounded wings and a long tail, and it uses that long tail as a rudder. And basically what it can do is it can navigate its way through trees and very acrobatically go in and go after cardinals or blue jays and things like that. So I really don't think that there is a need to put meat out for raptors or anything like that. And I think most of the birds, what we've seen is that when birds have quote unquote figured out that they can adapt to these habitats, those birds can do very well. And so another example is Merlin, which is a little small falcon that's really increasing in sort of the edges of towns, moving its population south. Really fun. I love these questions.
Well, and of course, Merlin is on your logo. Wonderful. Actually reflecting, and for those watching from the UK, the red kite population to the west of London was brought in, and now through the feeding stations, over the motorways around to the west of London, sort of about 50 miles or 50 kilometers, I suppose, west of London, there's just great, huge hordes of red kites flying around, big raptors flying around. It's from the feeding, but again, that's just how it's a success story in conservation, and now an interesting story about all those people having their chips stolen and things. So thank you, Israel. I have another question, another good question. So this is from Stephanie in Pasadena in the US, asks, do birds transform through interspecies mating? Also, what kind of bird is the purple one I saw for a while that seemed out of place compared to the others in the area? I think it might have been a question coming in of possibly something that you were sharing at the time. I hope that context is possible to work out.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe we can follow up over.
Yeah, so Stephanie, thank you for the question. We will look at the timestamp, work out when that came from, which video, and we'll respond by email to there. So thank you for the question. Stephen from Portland, there's a nice comment here, says, thank you once again, Viking, for fascinating, engaging and important information and for your choice of collaboration partners. Well, thank you, Stephen. And indeed, I may echo that. We're delighted and honoured to be working with Cornell. I have one from Emma in Highlands Ranch that asks quite a personal question, Chris, in a good way. Says, Chris, how did you meet your wife? You could choose to screen that if you want.
There are all sorts of
Emma from Highlands Ranch is someone that knows you.
that you can see it. Yeah, Highlands Ranch is near where I grew up, so maybe I do know you. So thanks for this. I actually met Jessie first. There we go. There she is. The wonders of technology, right? I met Jessie first before she got to the lab at a American Birding Association convention, and John Dunn, who's one of the the pioneers of the National Geographic Field Guide, he came up to me and he said, "There's this woman, Jessie Berry, that you really, really need to meet." And so I I said, well, I was gonna go out to the Pawnee National Grasslands to look for some birds. As long as she'll come with me to do that, sure, sounds good. And so Jessie and I got to be, good friends. I was a little older than her. I guess I still am technically the exact same number of days older as I was when I met. And she and I remained really good friends. We've communicated, stayed in touch, and then when she got to the lab, and I got to know her even more, she became even more irresistible. So we have something really special. We're able to work together at the lab, and then also work together at home on a variety of things, and then hopefully work together on some Viking cruises.
Oh, well, we hope so too. And indeed, well, thank you for taking the personal question. And Emma may know you, I guess. But I think conservation is all the better for it. Between you and Jessie, running eBird and Merlin between you, and the Macaulay Library as well. I mean, it's extraordinary.
Well, and I got to chime in there because it's, we have incredible team of people. And so I think that there's very little that, certainly in my case, that I do other than maybe listen to what the team has to suggest and look for some opportunities. But we are just tremendously fortunate to have the team of collaborators that we have on staff, but then also, around the world, all of the regional partners that we work with that share ideas, put in huge amounts of time into all aspects of the work that we do. And then, the members of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, if it weren't for you, we wouldn't be able to do this. So
I know I was being a bit lighthearted, and thank you for reminding me that it is such a huge team effort, isn't it? It's incredible. We're getting into just the last few questions. I was looking at the timestamp here. Just a couple of comments. Scott from Grapevine, the US, just says, Chris, thank you very much. So that's very nice. Thank you, Scott. Poonam, who hasn't given a location, says, in his view, the talking birds are the smartest. He loves parrots and manya. So thank you, Poonam. Another little comment here from Patria.
These are really great birds. They're actually closely related to starlings, European starlings.
Okay.
And European starlings also are, I have to agree, I mean, they're incredible birds. If you take the time to actually listen to a starling, they're also amazing mimics, just as the same way as like a northern mockingbird or catbirds here in the US. Starlings can imitate, dozens and dozens of different vocalizations. So the next time, they're not singing as much now, but next year, have a look at starlings. And then this time of year, starlings are starting to gather in these amazing flocks, and you can see just this magical artworart of just clouds of starlings as they fly overhead.
Over places like Rome. I believe they called murmurations.
Murmurations, exactly.
But I associate that with being in the streets of Rome in the evenings and just seeing, as you say, extraordinary patterns. But incredible birds. And I see that Deanna, I think, from the US, probably responded at the time that we were asking about the sounds, and says, was it a thrush of some sort, perhaps a Swainson's? So I don't know if that resonates with the sounds.
Yeah, it was a thrush. It was wood thrush.
Oh, well, Deanna, well done for spotting the thrush sound. And Mirka there's two more here, so penultimate one, Mirka from Montclair, who responded earlier about the peregrine, I recall, says, just a few weeks ago, I saw an indigo bunting in my backyard, so close that I took a good picture. I'd never seen the beautiful bird, and then now I see it in my yard, so close, it was awesome. So she's reflecting on indigo buntings as well as peregrines. I think she's lucky with her spots. And then the last is it's actually a comment which I think is nice to close on. And indeed, I didn't plan it this way, but it's very nice. It's just popped in. Patria from San Diego says, you can't beat Viking.TV for varied and interesting programming. I'm sure it will continue watching even after I'm able to explore the world in person, starting in July in Iceland. I will never cruise with anyone but Viking. Well, that's a very nice comment to finish on. Thank you, Patria. Noting the time, and Chris, thank you so much for fielding so many questions, including that one from Emma from your hometown, maybe. But once again, it's my privilege to thank you for your time. And in fact, I've actually just got one last question that's just come in that asks, what are the birds in Iceland?
There's incredible birds in Iceland, and instead of me answering this, I'll be sort of like the story of, instead of fishing for you, I'll teach you how to fish. So what I'd like to encourage you to do is to download the Merlin app, and then when you sign in, you'll see that there's a button that says Explore. And if you click on that, you can, so at the very bottom of this page, it says Explore Birds. When you click on that, it'll ask you for a location, and you can pick a location that you'll be going to. And this will work pretty much anywhere that Viking goes. You can put in the name of the stop, and it'll give you some of the birds that are most common there. And so as you get more interested in this, and maybe you want to see birds that you haven't seen, you can use Merlin to, when you've identified a bird, you can save that you've identified it. We teach you sort of how a scientist goes about saving it in terms of the date and the time and the location. And then you can use that Explore to see, well, what are the birds there that would be new that you haven't seen before? So there's some really fun things that you can do to explore that.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for that last question coming in. And I think it's a very nice way to finish it. That, as you say, it's not the bird, it's not the fish, but how to fish, or not the bird, but how to be a birder. And I'm going to reiterate my thanks. I'm also going to just say I am beyond excited with the collaboration plans that we have with the lab. And can't wait to be getting back to sea and out to sea for exploring the ends of the world and everywhere in between. So, Chris, thank you for your time. Thank you for your insight, your wisdom, and sharing your enthusiasm of what Cornell Laboratory does, or Cornell Lab, I should say, does. And I was going to say, if you obviously the mic for you to say a few words, Chris.
Yeah, well, thank you, Damon, so much. This is such a great opportunity for us, and I've enjoyed my time here. And I think that and I speak for everyone at the lab. We're excited to see where this adventure takes us, and I hope that we'll get to actually see and meet many of you on a Viking ship sometime in the future.
Absolutely, couldn't say it better myself. Well, thank you to Viking TV viewers too for your time. So until next time.